There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday evening, a shared couch, the low murmur of a documentary about deep-sea life you've both seen a dozen times. They were the camouflage of routine, of comfortable silence, of a friendship so deeply worn it feels like a feature of the landscape of your own soul. And then, something shifts. The weight of a head on your shoulder, a change in the rhythm of a sleeping breath, the sudden, terrifying awareness that the boundary you have so carefully policed for years has been crossed without a single word. You are no longer just two friends on a couch. You are a cartographer staring at a map where a continent has silently, irrevocably, drifted into a new position, and you have no name for the ocean that now lies between you. This was one of those moments. The weight of Alex's head on my shoulder was both a profound comfort and an unbearable pressure, a physical manifestation of the gravity I had felt pulling at me for the better part of 5 years. It was the anchor I never asked for, and the one I was terrified to lose. His hair, still faintly damp from the shower he'd taken in my bathroom an hour earlier, smelled of my own ridiculously expensive mint and rosemary shampoo. It was a scent I associated with my own quiet mornings, with the solitary ritual of starting a day. Now, it was tangled up with him, with the slow, even exhalation of his breath against the side of my neck, a warm tide rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to be syncing with the frantic, terrified drumbeat of my own heart. I was a photographer by trade, a quiet observer by nature. My entire life was built around the practice of noticing things other people missed, the way light caught the dust motes in a sunbeam, the fleeting expression on a stranger's face, the subtle geometry of shadows on a city street. I collected details. I archived them. It was how I made sense of the world. And for years, Alex had been my most complex, my most cherished, my most painful subject. I had a mental catalog of him so vast and detailed it could have filled a library. The exact shade of green his eyes turned in the late afternoon sun, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the way he'd drum his fingers on his thigh when he was lost in thought. But this was different. This was not observation. This was participation. The sensory data was overwhelming, flooding the carefully curated archives and threatening to wash away all the structures I had built to contain my feelings for him. The documentary narrator was droning on about bioluminescent creatures in the Mariana Trench, life thriving under pressures that should have been impossible. I felt a kinship with them. For years, I had been living under the crushing weight of my love for Alex, a love that felt just as impossible, just as unsuited for the environment of our friendship. I had learned to photosynthesize my own light in the darkness, to find a strange, lonely beauty in the depths of my unspoken affection. I could watch him date, watch him fall in and out of love, offer him a steady shoulder and a listening ear, and all the while, my own heart was performing this quiet, luminous, and deeply secret dance. It was a sustainable ecosystem, I had told myself. Lonely, but stable. But his head on my shoulder, the casual, trusting weight of it, was a geological event. It was the tectonic plates of our friendship grinding against each other, threatening to unleash the earthquake I had spent half a decade trying to prevent. My body was rigid, a statue trying to pretend it was a pillow, every muscle tensed with the effort of not flinching, not sighing, not giving away the seismic shift happening within me. I was terrified that if I moved, even a millimeter, he would wake up, and I was terrified that he wouldn't. We had met at a gas station. It sounds like the opening line of a forgettable road trip movie, a detail so mundane it hardly seems worth mentioning. Yet for me, it was the point of origin, the single coordinate from which the entire map of my adult life would be drawn. My car, a vintage, temperamental beast I loved more than was reasonable, had sputtered to a graceless halt right beside pump number 3 at a desolate, 24-hour station somewhere off a highway I rarely traveled. It was past midnight on a Wednesday, the air thick with the humid promise of a summer storm, the world lit only by the sickly green-white fluorescent glare of the station's canopy. I was stranded, frustrated, and profoundly alone. And then, a beat-up truck pulled in, and Alex stepped out. He was all easy confidence and restless energy, wearing a faded university sweatshirt and jeans, and he moved with a sort of casual athleticism that I, in my lanky, deliberate stillness, had always secretly admired. He saw me staring blankly at my car's engine, a useless pop of the hood that was more a gesture of desperation than of any real mechanical knowledge. He didn't just ask if I needed help. He seemed to assume it, striding over with a friendly, unassuming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His eyes held a deep, unshakable exhaustion, the look of someone running on fumes for far too long. It was the first detail I cataloged. He tinkered for a few minutes, his hands surprisingly deft, and quickly diagnosed a problem far beyond a roadside fix. While we waited for the tow truck I reluctantly called, we talked. It was an easy conversation, flowing in a way that conversations with strangers rarely did for me. He was a software consultant, working on a brutal project with an impossible deadline. He'd been driving for hours just to clear his head. I told him I was a photographer, and when he asked what kind, I found myself explaining my obsession with liminal spaces, with empty hallways, abandoned buildings, and late-night gas stations, places of transition that held the ghosts of the people who passed through them. He didn't look at me like I was strange. He just nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his tired eyes. He said, "So you take pictures of the places in between," and I knew, in that moment, that he saw something. He saw me. The tow truck came. My car was taken away to be resurrected, and he insisted on driving me home, an hour out of his way. I tried to refuse, but he had a gentle, implacable stubbornness. During that drive, the foundation of our friendship was laid. We talked about everything and nothing. Our favorite films, our shared love for a particular brand of terrible instant noodles, the weird anxieties of being in our late 20s and feeling like we were still waiting for our real lives to begin. By the time he dropped me off in front of my apartment building, the sky was beginning to pale with the first hints of dawn. He gave me his number, a casual, "Text me to let me know you got your car back," but it felt like something more. It felt like an invitation. I saved his name in my phone as Alex Gas Station, a placeholder I never got around to changing. It felt right. He was, and perhaps always would be, the place where one part of my life ended and a new, more complicated one began. Our friendship grew from there, quickly and with a startling lack of effort. It was a rare and beautiful thing. We fell into a rhythm of weekly dinners, of long hikes in the hills outside the city, of movie marathons that stretched late into the night. He was the extroverted counterpoint to my introverted nature. He would drag me to parties where I would stand awkwardly in a corner, and he would somehow make it feel okay, always looping back to check on me, bringing me a drink, introducing me to the one other person in the room who would rather talk about Tarkovsky films than sales quotas. In return, my quiet apartment became his sanctuary. He would come over after a grueling week of work, his energy finally depleted, and sink into my worn armchair, content to just sit in silence while I edited photos, the only sounds the click of my mouse and the hum of the refrigerator. We were a study in contrasts, but we fit. We were the missing pieces of each other's puzzles, filling in the gaps we didn't know we had. It took me 6 months to admit to myself that I was in love with him. It was a slow, creeping realization, a dawn I couldn't hold back. It wasn't a single moment, but 1,000 tiny ones. It was the way my breath would catch when he'd laugh, a full-throated, uninhibited sound of pure joy. It was the involuntary smile that would spread across my face when I'd see his name light up my phone screen. It was the specific, physical ache in my chest when I'd watch him leave my apartment, his retreating back a familiar silhouette against the streetlight glow. Admitting it to myself was one thing. Doing anything about it was another. He was, as far as I knew, completely and utterly straight. He talked about women, dated them, had his heart broken by them. The most significant of these was Sarah, a smart, fiery lawyer he dated for nearly 2 years. I liked her genuinely. I saw how she made him happy, and I buried my own feelings under layers of sincere, supportive friendship. I became his confidant, the person he would come to when he and Sarah had a fight, the person who would listen to him analyze their relationship down to the most minute detail. It was a special kind of torture, sitting there on my couch, nodding and offering neutral advice, while every word he spoke about her was a small, sharp paper cut on my own heart. I was the keeper of his stories, the archivist of his heartbreaks, all while my own love remained an uncatalogued, unacknowledged artifact, gathering dust in the most secure vault of my soul. The shift, when it came, was not sudden. It was a slow collapse, like a building giving way under its own weight after years of structural stress. Alex's big project at work, the one he had been pouring his life into for the better part of a year, failed. It wasn't just a setback. It was a public, spectacular implosion that took his confidence with it. He spoke about it in clipped, hollow sentences, the usual easy cadence of his voice gone, replaced by a monotone I barely recognized. Around the same time, his relationship with Sarah finally ended. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, but a slow, sad fizzle. A mutual recognition that they wanted different things from life, that the love they had shared had worn itself thin. The two events created a perfect storm of failure and loss that left him utterly adrift. He was a ship without a rudder, spinning in a vast, empty ocean, and the only port he could seem to find was my apartment. He showed up at my door late one night, unannounced. It wasn't unusual for him to drop by, but this time was different. The easy smile was gone, the light in his eyes extinguished. He looked smaller, somehow diminished. He just stood there on my doormat, his shoulders slumped, and said my name, Jules, his voice barely a whisper. It was a question and a plea all in one. I stepped aside and let him in without a word. He walked into my living room and sank onto the couch, the same couch we were on now, months later, and just stared at the blank television screen. He didn't want to talk about the project. He didn't want to talk about Sarah. He didn't seem to want anything at all, except, perhaps, to not be alone. I understood that need. It was a language I was fluent in. So I didn't push. I didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. I just made him a cup of tea, the way he liked it, with too much honey, and put on an old, familiar movie we both loved, keeping the volume low. I sat in the armchair across from him and worked on my photos, letting the comfortable silence fill the space between us. For hours, he just sat there, breathing. It felt like I was watching someone relearn how to do it. That night, he fell asleep on the couch. I found a blanket and draped it over him, my movements slow and careful, as if he were a wild, wounded animal that might bolt at the slightest disturbance. I watched him sleep for a long time, his face, usually so animated and expressive, smoothed out and vulnerable in the dim light. The lines of stress around his eyes and mouth were gone, replaced by a childlike peace. A fierce, painful wave of protectiveness washed over me. I wanted to build a fortress around him, to stand guard against the failures and heartbreaks of the world. But all I could do was leave a glass of water on the coffee table and go to my own bed, where I lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of his breathing from the other room. It was the first night he stayed. It would not be the last. The ritual began subtly, born of unspoken need and plausible deniability. Alex started staying over more frequently. At first, there were always excuses. My commute is brutal. Is it cool if I crash here tonight? Or, I think my upstairs neighbor is learning to play the drums. I can't take it. The excuses grew thinner, more transparent, until they disappeared altogether, replaced by a simple, questioning look at the end of an evening, a silent "can I stay?" that I always answered with a silent "of course." My apartment became his second home, our routines merging. We'd cook dinner together, his chaotic energy in the kitchen a stark contrast to my methodical precision. We'd fall into our familiar spots on the couch, the cushions slowly molding to the shape of our bodies. My home, once my solitary fortress, now had a second occupant, his presence a constant, low-level hum of warmth in the background of my life. It was everything I had ever wanted, and it terrified me. The first time he touched me, really touched me, was about a month into this new arrangement. It was another late night, another documentary, this one about the migration patterns of whales. He had been quiet all evening, his thoughts clearly a million miles away. He shifted on the couch, a restless movement, and then, With a soft sigh that sounded like the release of some long-held tension, he leaned his head against my shoulder. My entire world tilted on its axis. It was the moment I had just been reliving, the moment that felt like the beginning of the end, or maybe the end of the beginning. I remember the exact frame on the television screen, a massive blue whale, its eye the size of a dinner plate, staring out into the endless, dark water. I felt like that whale, a huge, solitary creature suddenly confronted with a presence it couldn't comprehend. His touch was not romantic, not yet. It was an act of pure, unadulterated exhaustion, a gesture of trust so profound it made my throat ache. He was seeking comfort, a solid place to rest in the turbulent waters of his own life, and he had chosen me. He had chosen this quiet, unassuming harbor. And I, the harbor master, could do nothing but hold perfectly still and pray the storm would not destroy us both. He fell asleep like that, his breathing evening out into the slow, deep rhythm that was becoming as familiar to me as my own. The initial shock gave way to a fragile, aching tenderness. I studied the curve of his ear, the way a few strands of his dark hair curled against his temple. This was the dangerous territory, the space where friendship blurred into something more. I was so used to loving him from a distance, to keeping my feelings neatly contained. But with his head on my shoulder, his warmth seeping into my skin, the distance was gone. The container was cracking. I was no longer just the observer. I was part of the scene, inextricably linked to him, my body a landscape for his rest. The documentary ended, the credits rolled, and the apartment fell into a deep, profound silence, broken only by the sound of our breathing. I didn't move for over an hour, my arm going numb, my muscles screaming in protest. I was afraid that if I shifted, the spell would break, and he would retreat back to his side of the couch, the invisible wall between us rebuilt, thicker than before. I was a prisoner of his trust, and it was the most beautiful, agonizing captivity I had ever known. The couch, once a symbol of his refuge, soon became a point of contention, at least in his telling. He started complaining about it in the mornings, rubbing his back with a theatrical groan. "Jules, this thing was designed by a sadist," he'd say, and I'd just smile and hand him a mug of coffee. I knew my couch was comfortable. This was a pretext, a gentle testing of boundaries. I saw the narrative he was constructing, the logical steps he was laying down to lead him to where he subconsciously wanted to go. I offered to take the couch myself, to let him have my bed. "No way," he'd said, shaking his head vehemently. "It's your place. I'm the one who's imposing." The word imposing hung in the air, a deliberate choice. He was giving me an out, a chance to say, "You're right, you should go home," but we both knew I wouldn't take it. The inevitable solution presented itself one night, unspoken, mutually agreed upon without a single word of negotiation. He had complained about his back again, and I had made my usual offer to take the couch. He had refused, as usual. We stood in the hallway between the living room and my bedroom, a narrow, liminal space. The silence stretched. My bedroom door was open, a rectangle of soft, inviting darkness. He looked at the door, then at me, then back at the door. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, casual, but his eyes were fixed on mine, searching for a reaction. "You know," he said, "it's a big bed. We could just share. It's dumb for one of us to sleep on the couch." It was a logical fallacy presented as unassailable logic. My bed was a queen, not a king. It was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a big bed for two grown men. But I didn't point that out. I just felt a slow, hot flush creep up my neck. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. This was it. The next door, the next room, the next level of this strange, terrifying game we were playing. I gave a small, non-committal shrug, trying to match his casual tone. "If you want." It doesn't matter to me, a lie. It mattered more than anything. He gave a quick, relieved nod, as if I had just solved a complex mathematical equation for him. And just like that, the boundary was redrawn. That night, for the first time, we went to our separate sides of the same bed. The geography of my bed became a new world I had to learn to navigate. The first night was an exercise in extreme self-control. We lay stiffly on our respective edges, a 4-inch gulf of sheet and blanket between us that felt as wide and as cold as the North Atlantic. I was hyper-aware of everything. The whisper of the fabric as he shifted his weight. The change in the air temperature caused by his body heat. The sound of his swallow in the dark. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling, my hands clasped tightly over my chest, as if to physically restrain my heart. I was convinced he could hear it, that its frantic rhythm was a desperate Morse code confessing everything I had worked so hard to hide. I felt like an explosive device, armed and sensitive, and his proximity was the trigger. I prayed for sleep to come and disarm me, but it eluded me for hours. As the nights passed, the ritual became more established, and the tension, while never fully dissipating, changed in character. It evolved from pure anxiety into a kind of low-grade, chronic ache of longing. The rigid formality of that first night slowly softened. The 4-inch gulf between us would shrink. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would wake up to find he had rolled over, his back now a warm, solid wall just inches from my own. I would lie there, utterly still, breathing in the scent of him, a mixture of soap and sleep, and something that was uniquely, indefinably Alex. I would memorize the curve of his spine, the shape of his shoulders under the thin cotton of his t-shirt. These were secret moments, stolen in the dark, my own private exhibition of the man I loved. I was the sole patron of a museum that opened only after midnight. There were nights when the proximity was almost unbearable. One night, I awoke from a dream to find his hand lying on the mattress between us, palm up, his fingers slightly curled. It was an invitation I knew he wasn't consciously making. It was just a hand, sleeping. But to me, it was a question. My own hand ached with the need to respond, to close the gap, to let my fingers lace with his. I imagined the feel of his skin against mine, the gentle pressure of his grasp. The fantasy was so vivid, so powerful, that I had to physically clench my fists at my sides, digging my nails into my palms to ground myself, to remind myself of the rules. The rules were unwritten, but I knew them by heart. We were sharing a space, a bed, a temporary life. But we were not sharing hearts. His was not mine to take. And so I would lie there, inches from him, starving in a room full of bread, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, signaling the end of the long night's vigil. This period of our lives was a study in dualities. It was both the most comforting and the most excruciating time I had ever experienced. Having him there, a constant presence in my home, soothed a deep loneliness in me I hadn't fully acknowledged. I loved the simple domesticity of it, the way he'd leave his coffee mug by the sink, the sight of his worn-out running shoes by my door, the sound of his key in the lock at the end of the day. My apartment, which had always been just a place I lived, had started to feel like a home. But the intimacy was a double-edged sword. Every shared meal, every shared silence, every night spent in the same bed was a reminder of the one thing we didn't share, the one thing I wanted more than anything else. I was living in a beautiful, fragile snow globe, a perfect, self-contained world. But I knew that one wrong move, one honest word, could shatter it into a million pieces. The tension had been building for weeks, a slow, inexorable rise in atmospheric pressure that signaled an impending storm. The air in my apartment felt thick with it, charged with everything we weren't saying. The quiet nights in my bed were no longer just fraught with my own internal monologue. I could feel a restlessness emanating from him, too. He was sleeping less, turning more, his sighs in the dark heavier, more frequent. The careful architecture of our platonic arrangement was beginning to crumble, the foundation stressed to its breaking point. I knew something had to give. I just didn't know it would be him. It was a Tuesday night, indistinguishable from any other. A light rain was falling outside, the sound a soft, rhythmic patter against the window pane. We had gone to bed early, both of us claiming exhaustion. We lay in our usual positions, back to back, the familiar gulf of mattress between us. But the silence was different tonight. It wasn't the comfortable, sleepy silence of routine. It was a loud silence, a silence full of weight and intention. I lay there, my senses on high alert, waiting. For what? I didn't know. Then, his voice cut through the darkness, quiet and hesitant, but it felt like a shout. Jules. My heart stopped, then restarted with a painful thud. I had been waiting for this, dreading it, hoping for it. I kept my own voice as steady as I could, a feat of immense effort. Yeah, I said, my voice sounding rough to my own ears. The silence stretched again, for a count of maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I could hear the rain, my own blood pounding in my ears, and then the soft rustle of sheets. He was moving. He was rolling over. I didn't dare move myself. I kept my back to him, my eyes squeezed shut, every muscle in my body tensed. I could feel his warmth now, closer than it had ever been. He was no longer on his side of the bed. He was in the middle, in the no-man's land we had so carefully respected. I can't sleep, he whispered. His voice was right behind my ear, a warm breath against my skin that sent a shiver down my entire spine. I swallowed hard, trying to find my own voice. What's wrong? I asked, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He was quiet for another long moment, and I could feel the conflict rolling off him in waves. I don't know, he finally said, his voice strained. Everything just feels wrong. Off. I knew what he meant. The delicate balance we had maintained was gone. We were in a new, uncharted territory, and we were both lost. I finally found the courage to move. Slowly, I rolled over to face him. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes wide and dark and fixed on mine. He was so close I could see the faint outline of his eyelashes, smell the honey from the tea we'd had hours before on his breath. The space between our faces was charged, electric. It was the most intimate we had ever been, more intimate than any of the nights spent sharing a bed, because this was intentional. This was a confrontation. He looked terrified. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, warring with the urge to jump. Jules, he breathed, his voice cracking on my name. Can I ask you something stupid? My own voice was a stranger to me when I answered, a low whisper. Anything. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at me, his gaze searching my face for something. Permission, rejection, understanding. I held his gaze, trying to communicate everything I couldn't say, that it was okay, that I was there, that whatever the question was, the answer was yes. The air grew thick, heavy. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between us, the sound of the rain, and the frantic beating of two hearts. And then, he spoke the words that shattered the world I knew and built a new one in its place. Would it be okay? He whispered, the words trembling with a vulnerability I had never heard from him before. If I kissed you? Time stopped. The rain, the city, my own breathing, it all ceased to exist. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us like a fragile, perfect glass sculpture. It wasn't a proposition. It wasn't a move. It was a confession. It was the terrified, hopeful plea of a man who had finally found his way to the edge of a truth he didn't understand. In that moment, all my years of silent longing, of careful observation, of disciplined self-denial, coalesced into a single, overwhelming clarity. He wasn't asking for my body. He was asking for my permission to be vulnerable, to be confused, to be seen. He was asking if this harbor was truly as safe as he had believed it to be. My own fear, the constant companion of my love for him, simply evaporated, burned away by the raw honesty in his eyes. I didn't need to think. I didn't need to analyze. For the first time in my life with him, I just needed to act. I whispered the only word that mattered. Yes. He closed his eyes, a flicker of profound relief passing over his features, as if my single word had unburdened him of a crushing weight. And then, slowly, hesitantly, he closed the remaining distance between us. His lips met mine not with passion or with demand, but with a gentle, questioning pressure. It was the softest kiss I had ever known. It was tentative, uncertain, a conversation without words. His hand, which had been resting on the mattress, came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek in a gesture of such exquisite tenderness it almost broke me. I brought my own hand up to rest on his chest, feeling the wild, frantic beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was a mirror of my own. We were not two separate entities anymore. We were two halves of the same terrified, hopeful question, and this kiss was the beginning of the answer. It tasted of rain and honey and years of unspoken things. It was not an ending. It was a key turning in a lock I didn't even know I was waiting to be opened. It was the start of everything. The morning after was a study in silence and absence. I woke up slowly, drifting up from a sleep that had, for the first time in months, been deep and dreamless. The space beside me in the bed was empty. The sheets were cold. For a confused moment, I thought I had imagined it all. The whispered question, the shattering tenderness of the kiss, the feeling of his heart beating against my hand. But then I saw it. A folded piece of paper on his pillow. My stomach clenched. I knew, even before I touched it, that it was not a love letter. The note was short, his usually neat handwriting reduced to a hasty scrawl. Had to run. Early meeting. Talk later. Oh, that was it. No mention of the night before. No, I'm sorry. No, that was amazing. No, we need to talk. Just the brutal efficiency of a business memo. Talk later. A promise so vague it was barely a promise at all. A cold dread, familiar and heavy, settled in my gut. The hope that had bloomed in the darkness, so fragile and new, began to wither under the harsh light of morning. I replayed the kiss in my mind, searching for a sign I had missed. Had I been too eager? Not eager enough. Had my yes been a mistake? Had I misinterpreted the most profound moment of my life? I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of confused, grief-stricken vulnerability for a genuine emotional breakthrough. He had been adrift, I told myself, and he had reached for the nearest lifeline. I was a port in a storm, nothing more. And now that the storm had passed, he had set sail again, leaving the harbor behind without a backward glance. The pain was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The next few days were a special kind of hell. Talk later turned into a day, then two, then a week of crushing silence. My phone, which had once been a source of constant connection to him, became an instrument of torture. I would stare at it, willing it to light up with his name. I would compose and delete 100 different text messages, ranging from angry and accusatory, "What the hell, Alex?" to pleading and pathetic, "Are you okay?" I sent none of them. My pride, what little I had left, wouldn't let me. But my silence was also a form of cowardice. I was terrified of the answer. I was terrified of him confirming my worst fears, that it was a mistake, that he was sorry, that he wanted to forget it ever happened. The silence, as agonizing as it was, at least allowed me to keep a sliver of hope alive. It allowed for the possibility that he was just busy, just scared, just trying to figure things out. But with every passing hour, that sliver of hope grew thinner and more transparent, until it was barely there at all. My apartment, which had so recently become a home, reverted to being just a space. But now it was a space haunted by his absence. His ghost was everywhere. In the empty space on the couch, in the extra mug sitting clean in the dish rack, in the deafening silence of my bedroom at night. I started sleeping on the couch myself, unable to bear the vast, empty expanse of the bed we had shared. The fortress I had built to protect my heart from him had been breached, and now, in his absence, the walls had crumbled completely, leaving me exposed and shivering in the ruins. I had allowed myself to believe, for one brief, shining moment, that the narrative could change, that the quiet observer could become a participant in the story. Now I was back where I started, watching from a distance. Only the distance was no longer just emotional. It was physical, and it was absolute. After a week of this self-imposed torment, something inside me snapped. The hurt, which had been a dull, constant ache, sharpened into a clear, cold anger. An anger at him, for his cowardice, but also an anger at myself, for letting his silence dictate my reality. I had given him my trust, my vulnerability, my yes, I deserved more than a scribbled note and a week of avoidance. I deserved an explanation. I deserved the truth, no matter how much it might break me. The not knowing was the poison. Rejection would be a clean wound, painful but survivable. This limbo was a slow, creeping infection that was poisoning everything. That evening, I put on my jacket, my hands moving with a decisiveness I hadn't felt in days, and walked out of my apartment. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I was going to his apartment, and I was not going to leave until I had an answer. His building was only a few miles from mine, but the drive felt like crossing a continent. When I got to his floor, I stood outside his door for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it, the point of no return. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet hallway. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. "Alex," I called out, my voice firmer than I expected. "I know you're in there. Open the door." I heard a faint shuffling from inside, then silence. I was about to knock again when the lock clicked, and the door opened a few inches. The man standing in the sliver of darkness was a stranger. It was Alex, but it wasn't the Alex I knew. His hair was unkempt. He was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on a week ago, and his eyes were hollowed out, bloodshot. The apartment behind him was dark, save for the flickering blue light of a television screen. The air that drifted out smelled stale, of old takeout and neglect. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the floor, his hand still on the doorknob, blocking the entrance. "Jules," he mumbled. "Now's not a good time." "No," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "We're past that. I'm not leaving until we talk." I didn't push my way in. I just stood there, waiting. He finally let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of complete and utter defeat, and stepped back, letting the door swing open. I stepped inside, and he closed it behind me, plunging us into near darkness. The living room was a disaster zone. Pizza boxes and empty Chinese food containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over the furniture. It was the physical manifestation of a downward spiral. He sank onto his couch, not looking at me, and picked up the remote, turning the volume on the television up, then down, then off. He was avoiding. I walked over and stood in front of him, blocking his view of the blank screen. "Look at me, Alex," I said. My anger had dissipated, replaced by a wave of profound sadness for him, for us. He slowly, reluctantly, lifted his head. The confident, easygoing man I knew was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and terrified. "I'm not going to yell," I continued, my voice softening. "I'm not here to fight. I need you to be honest with me. What happened? What was that? Was it a mistake? If it was, just tell me. Just say the words, and I will walk out of here, and I will never mention it again. We can go back to how things were. But this silence, it's killing me, Alex. It's worse than anything you could possibly say." He stared at me, his expression unreadable for a moment. And then, his face crumpled. It was like watching a dam break. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek, then another. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. My resolve to be firm, to demand answers, crumbled. I sat down on the couch next to him, the space between us feeling both vast and insignificant. I didn't touch him. I just sat there, a silent witness to his unraveling, just as I had been all those weeks ago in my own apartment. After a long time, his sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweatshirt, and finally, he spoke. "I'm so sorry, Jules," he whispered, his voice thick and raw. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a coward." He still wouldn't look at me. He was staring at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists on his knees. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, the words barely audible. "That's what's been screwing me up. It wasn't a mistake. It felt more right than anything has felt in, maybe ever. And that scared the hell out of me." He took a shaky breath. I don't think about guys, Jules. I don't. It's not who I am. Or it's not who I thought I was. And when I kissed you, and it felt like that, like coming home, I just panicked. I felt like my whole world had tilted, and I didn't know which way was up anymore." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading confusion. "I thought I was breaking you," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I was this selfish monster, using your friendship, your kindness, because I was lonely and messed up. I thought I was taking advantage of you. And I couldn't face that. I couldn't face you. I thought if I stayed away, if I just disappeared for a while, I could protect you from me, from my confusion. I was trying to save our friendship, and instead I just destroyed it, didn't I?" His words were a torrent, a confession poured out into the dark, quiet room. He wasn't rejecting me. He was confessing his fear. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't feel anything. He was pushing me away because he felt everything, and he didn't have a map for this new, terrifying emotional landscape. The anger and hurt that had been my constant companions for a week dissolved completely, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost knocked the wind out of me. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, lost in the dark and afraid. I listened to his confession, to the raw, painful honesty of it, and I felt the last of my own protective walls crumble. He wasn't a villain. He was just as lost as I had been for years. Only his journey into this wilderness was new and sudden, whereas I had been living in it for half a decade. I saw his fear, his confusion, and I recognized it as the same fear that had kept me silent for so long. The fear of naming something, and in doing so, changing it forever. But we were past that now. Things had already changed. Silence was no longer an option. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage I had been hoarding for years. I shifted on the couch, closing the small distance between us, my knee brushing against his. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, but he didn't pull away. "You didn't destroy it," I said, my voice soft but firm in the quiet room. "Our friendship is stronger than that. And you're not breaking me." I paused, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was my cliff, my moment to jump. "Alex," I began, and his eyes flickered up to meet mine. "You can't break something that's already been broken for years. And you can't take advantage of something that's been freely given." He looked at me, his confusion deepening. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. And so, in the wreckage of his apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of our shared silence, I finally told him my truth. "I'm in love with you, Alex," I said. The words, which had lived inside my head for so long, felt strange and momentous spoken aloud. They hung in the air between us, solid and real. I have been for years. Probably since that first night at the gas station. If I'm being honest with myself. Everything, watching you with Sarah, listening to you talk about your life, having you in my home, it's all been filtered through that. So when you kissed me, it wasn't a shock. It wasn't you taking advantage of me. For me, it was an answer. It was the conversation I'd been waiting years to have, without ever believing it would actually happen. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He looked like I had just rewritten the laws of physics in front of him. He was processing it, recontextualizing years of our friendship through this new, staggering piece of information. All those nights on my couch, all those shared meals, all my quiet support. He was seeing it all in a new light. He wasn't a predator who had preyed on an unsuspecting friend. He was a man who had been subconsciously drawn to a love that was already there, a quiet, steady warmth he had mistaken for simple friendship. He shook his head slowly, a look of dawning, painful wonder on his face. All this time he breathed. "You never said anything." I was scared, I admitted. "Just like you are now. I was terrified of losing you, of losing this. Our friendship was the most important thing in my life. I wasn't willing to risk it, but you are now," he stated, his voice full of awe. "I have to be," I said simply. "Because this." I gestured between us, to the mess of his apartment, to the week of agonizing silence. "This isn't working either." We sat in silence for a long time after that, but it was a different kind of silence. It was a constructive silence, a silence of processing and realignment. The unspoken had finally been spoken. The secrets were out. We were two cartographers with a new, terrifying, and exhilarating map spread out before us, and for the first time, we were looking at it together. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I don't know what this means, Jules. I don't know who I am, or what I want. I feel like I'm standing in the middle of a fog, And I can't see the path. I know, I said. That's okay. I reached out, hesitantly, and laid my hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. His skin was warm. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. We don't have to have it all figured out. We just have to agree not to run away from the fog. We can stay in it. Together. He looked at my hand on his arm, and then back at my face. A small, watery, but genuine smile touched his lips for the first time in a week. Together, he repeated, the word tasting new and hopeful. He took a deep, shuddering breath, like a man surfacing after being underwater for too long. Okay, he said. Okay, Jules. Together, he then did something that surprised me. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closing. His hand came up and covered mine on his arm. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing, two lost ships who had finally found the same coordinates, agreeing to navigate the strange, new waters side by side. The new normal had begun, not with a passionate declaration, but with a quiet, mutual agreement to be brave. We didn't stay at his apartment. The air there was too heavy with the ghosts of the past week. Without a word, we both stood up. I started gathering the trash, and he went into his bedroom and emerged a few minutes later with a small duffel bag. It was an unspoken decision. We were going back to my place. Back to our place. The drive back was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind we used to have. It was a silence no longer filled with anxiety and unspoken questions, but with a fragile, nascent understanding. When we got to my apartment, it felt different. It felt like a home again, but a new version of it. A home we were choosing to build together, consciously this time. That night, when we went to bed, there was no hesitation. There was no discussion of who would sleep where. We simply got into the bed that had been the stage for so much of our silent drama. But the geography had changed. He didn't turn his back to me. He faced me, and I faced him. We lay there in the dark, just looking at each other. The space between us no longer a chasm, but a small, sacred country of its own. He reached out his hand, not tentatively this time, but with a quiet certainty, and his fingers laced with mine. His palm was warm and dry and strong. It felt like an anchor. It felt like coming home. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The conversation was happening in the steady pressure of his hand, in the soft sound of our synchronized breathing. For the first time, we didn't just share a bed. We shared the night. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I fell asleep not with a heart full of anxious longing, but with one full of a quiet, peaceful, and utterly terrifying hope. The days that followed were a process of gentle discovery. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The old rhythms of our friendship were still there, the shared jokes, the movie marathons, the easy silences, but they were now overlaid with a new layer of intimacy. It manifested in small, quiet gestures. A hand on the small of my back as I made coffee in the morning. His head resting not just on my shoulder, but in my lap as we read on the couch. The first time he kissed me in the daylight, a quick, soft press of his lips in the middle of a conversation, was so unexpected and so natural that all I could do was smile. He was still scared, still confused at times. There were moments I could see the fog roll back into his eyes, the uncertainty clouding his features. But now, instead of running, he would reach for my hand. He would ground himself in my presence, in our shared reality. We talked. We had the conversations we should have had years ago, and the ones we couldn't have had until now. He told me about the slow unraveling of his relationship with Sarah, the feeling of performing a version of himself he thought he was supposed to be. He talked about his career, the pressure to succeed, the hollowness he felt even when he did. I told him about the loneliness of my love for him, the strange, bittersweet beauty I had found in observing him from afar. We laid our cards on the table, all of them. Our fears, our insecurities, our deepest, most carefully guarded hopes. It was like we were two archaeologists, carefully brushing the dust off the artifacts of our own hearts and showing them to each other for the first time. It was terrifying, and it was liberating. One evening, about a month after the confrontation at his apartment, we were lying in bed, reading. The rain was falling outside, just as it had been on the night of the first kiss. It felt like a circle closing. He put his book down and turned to me. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "that night at the gas station, when you told me you took pictures of the places in between. I think I get it now." I looked at him, waiting. "I think," he continued, his gaze intense, "that I've been living my whole life in a place in between. Between who I thought I was supposed to be and who I actually am. Between what I thought I wanted and what my heart was looking for without me even knowing it." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his touch gentle. "You weren't just the photographer of those places, Jules. You were the first place that didn't feel in between. You felt like a destination. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. And then there are moments that are so clear, so bright, so undeniably significant that they take your breath away. That was one of them." In his words, I found the resolution to years of quiet yearning. The story of the quiet observer and the unknowing initiator had found its final chapter. Or rather, its first. Because this wasn't an ending. This was the real beginning. The journey through the fog was not over, but we were no longer afraid of it. We had found our light, not in a grand, blinding flash, but in the quiet, steady flame of a shared truth, a shared vulnerability. We had learned to navigate by the stars of our own hearts, and we had found that they led us, impossibly and inevitably, to each other. In the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create. In the quiet sanctuary of the home we were building together, we began to heal.